June 1897, Spithead, Hampshire. The sea lies flat and gray beneath a low sky, dotted with the silhouettes of battleships gathered for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee Review. Steam whistles echo across the Solent. From the decks of the Royal Navy's finest, officers and foreign attachés watch the ordered line of armor and gunmetal pride. Then, almost unnoticed at first, a small, narrow hull slips from the harbor mouth. Barely 100 feet long, white-painted, with no guns, no ensign of command. It hums rather than chuffs. Within seconds, a pale wake fans out behind it, broadening, brightening, until the vessel streaks past the fleet like a phantom, throwing spray over the admiral's barges. Some observers shout that it must be a torpedo. Others simply stare. No Royal Navy ship has ever moved so fast. At its helm stands an engineer, Charles Algernon Parsons, his experimental turbine screaming at unheard-of revolutions, driving a forbidden screw design no committee had sanctioned. In that brief moment, centuries of marine engineering tradition are left behind in the froth of the Solent. The Admiralty will never forget what they saw that day, and Britain's approach to ship propulsion will never be the same. By the closing years of the 19th century, Britain ruled the sea through weight, not speed. The Royal Navy's ships were engines of empire, armored giants driven by pistons and crankshafts, their rhythm the heartbeat of maritime power. Each vessel was a world of reciprocating motion, connecting rods the length of men, steam hissing through valves, oil and graphite staining the decks below. They were magnificent and exhausting. The reciprocating engine had carried Britain through the century, from Brunel's iron leviathans to the dreadnoughts taking shape in the slips of Portsmouth and Barrow. Yet by 1890 the system had reached its natural limit. Every increase in power demanded larger cylinders and heavier machinery, until more energy was spent driving metal than moving water. Speeds above 20 knots came at a punishing cost in vibration, fuel, and maintenance. Propellers, slow-turning four-bladed screws, bit the sea unevenly, shuddering through cavitation bubbles that shook entire hulls. Engineers could hear the damage in the water, but no one knew how to silence it. Still, the Admiralty was cautious. Tradition and security mattered more than experiment. Naval contracts supported whole industrial districts. Any unproven idea risked thousands of jobs and the fleet's reliability. The great yards, John Brown on the Clyde, Vickers at Barrow, Thornycroft on the Thames, worked to specifications issued by Whitehall that changed only after long debate. To question the accepted machinery was to challenge the establishment itself. Innovation would have to come from the margins. Across the wider world, power was shifting. Germany had united and begun to build. France maintained a fast torpedo fleet, and the United States was emerging as an industrial competitor. The Admiralty's planners feared a new kind of naval warfare. Swift, lightweight craft armed with self-propelled torpedoes able to threaten the heavy battle line. If the Empire's future lay in fast response and global reach, the great ships would need to move faster and farther than ever before. Yet, the means to do so seemed bound by physics as much as bureaucracy. Into this landscape stepped a generation of inventors, trained not in the slipways, but in the laboratories. The Industrial Revolution had matured into the age of engineering, physics and mathematics applied to metal and motion. The new profession spoke the language of energy, efficiency, and entropy rather than mere horsepower. They sought ways to turn heat into thrust with elegance instead of brute force. Among them was a quiet, precise man educated in Cambridge mathematics and raised amid dynamos and drawing boards. Charles Algernon Parsons belonged to that rare breed who could translate theory into brass. The son of the astronomer William Parsons, the 3rd Earl of Ross, he had grown up watching the giant telescope at Birr Castle sweep the heavens, but his gaze turned inward, to turbines, pressure, and flow. He joined Armstrong and Co. at Elswick, where he studied the inefficiencies of marine engines and the wasted energy lost in piston friction. Steam, he realized, need not move in jerks. It could spin continuously, like light through a lens. By the early 1890s, Parsons had refined his vision of a compact, high-speed steam turbine capable of turning a shaft at thousands of revolutions per minute, far faster than any engine the Admiralty had ever tolerated. The problem was coupling such a device to the slow, heavy screws that pushed warships through the sea. The Navy's engineers warned that a fast turbine would race itself to pieces if attached directly to a propeller. The metal could not bear the stress, nor the cavitation that would follow. The idea was politely dismissed. In an age ruled by committees, the turbine seemed not merely untested but forbidden by common sense. Yet Parsons persisted. He began to design his own vessel to prove the principle at sea, a private experiment beyond Admiralty control. It would be small, narrow, and light, driven by a turbine feeding multiple propellers of his own design. If the numbers on his slide rule were right, Tian, 1893, inside a modest workshop at Heaton, Newcastle upon Tyne, Charles Parsons and a handful of trusted draftsmen began their quiet revolution. No naval contracts, no Admiralty oversight, just a small group of engineers experimenting with polished brass blades and finely balanced shafts. Their aim was simple yet audacious: to harness steam directly into rotary motion, cutting away the weight and inefficiency of pistons altogether. The turbine itself was an elegant cylinder of steel, lined with hundreds of tiny blades arranged in precise concentric rings. Steam, entering at high pressure, expanded through each ring, transferring energy to the rotor in a smooth, continuous flow. Where the old reciprocating engines lurched and hammered, the turbine purred, a near-silent hum compared with the rhythmic thunder of pistons. But to make it practical, Parsons needed a propeller system capable of absorbing that high rotational speed without tearing itself apart. Traditional propellers turned slowly, 2 or 4 blades, pitched steeply for grip. At high revolutions, the tips cavitated, forming vapor bubbles that robbed thrust and shook the hull. Parsons' solution was radical: smaller, faster, and many of them. Instead of a single large screw, he fitted several in series along the same shaft line, 3 on each of 3 shafts, 9 in total. Each set of blades shared the load, dividing the stress and allowing extraordinary revolutions per minute. It was a configuration that defied the Admiralty's every instinct. No precedent, no data, no test facility could prove it safe. By 1894, the experimental hull took shape at the yard of Brown and Hood on the Tyne. At just over 100 feet long, Turbinia was lean and purposeful, built not for armament, but for proof. Her turbine generated some 2,000 horsepower at 18,000 revolutions per minute, an unimaginable figure for a vessel of her size. On her first trials, observers on the Tyne watched with disbelief as she sliced through the water at more than 30 knots, fully 10 faster than the Navy's fastest destroyers. Yet official interest remained lukewarm. Admiralty engineers acknowledged the achievement but questioned its practicality. Too delicate, some said, unsuitable for heavy ships. Others feared the shock of adoption, the upheaval to design offices, workshops, and training. The old engine builders, whose factories filled the Tyne and Clyde, had vested interests in reciprocating machinery. Change threatened livelihoods as much as doctrine. Parsons' propeller arrays were dismissed as unsafe for warships. Requests for official trials were declined. Privately, the inventor felt the weight of indifference more keenly than outright rejection. He believed the technology could transform not only warships, but merchant liners, making crossings faster and more economical. Yet without Admiralty endorsement, the turbine would remain an engineering curiosity. What he required was a demonstration so public, so undeniable that no committee could ignore it. Over the next 3 years, he refined Turbinia in secrecy, adjusting propeller angles, blade numbers, and gearings. Each trial brought new data. The smooth turbine motion produced less vibration than any engine before it. Cups of tea could sit unspilled at full speed. Engineers who came to see the vessel left quietly astonished. But in official circles, the invention was still spoken of as a risk to reliable propulsion. The unwritten rule of the day was caution. A device too advanced was a device not yet safe. Parsons, ever measured, waited. He believed in demonstration over argument, and in the summer of 1897, opportunity arrived. Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee Naval Review at Spithead, an assembly of the world's fleets before the eyes of the Empire and its guests. Here, under the scrutiny of admirals, foreign envoys, and press correspondents, every great power would parade its strength. The Navy would show its armored might, its disciplined order, its ironclad supremacy. Uninvited, Parsons made his own plans. Turbinia would attend, not as part of the review, but as a challenge to it. Her turbine had been refined to perfection. Her 9 propellers gleamed beneath the waterline. Her crew was ready, her fuel bunkers filled. When the fleet gathered at Spithead, they would witness something never seen before in maritime history. A ship propelled not by pistons and pounding rods, but by the smooth, continuous scream of a turbine, faster, lighter, and infinitely more efficient. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable demonstrations in British engineering. His ship would outrun anything afloat. Charles Algernon Parsons was not a showman. His contemporaries described him as calm, courteous, and quietly methodical, a man who preferred the slide rule to the spotlight. Yet beneath the composure lay a stubborn independence that no committee could contain. He embodied a particular strain of British engineer, disciplined by science, but guided by instinct, respectful of tradition, yet unafraid of heresy when the numbers proved him right. To colleagues at Heaton, Parsons was a figure of near monastic focus. His notes, preserved today in the Science Museum archives, reveal precise sketches of blades and pressure stages, annotated in his careful hand. He worked long after others had gone home, checking tolerances, recalculating stresses, perfecting the geometry of flow. His faith lay in mathematics, not persuasion. Yet that restraint, paradoxically, limited him. He lacked the bombast that impressed committees or the rhetoric that won contracts. At heart, Parsons sought not glory, but understanding. He viewed machinery as an expression of natural order, energy guided by geometry. His turbine was, to him, a simple refinement of logic. Why convert steam's smooth pressure into the violent reciprocation of pistons when it could turn a wheel directly? But in challenging convention, he exposed himself to ridicule. Newspapers called Turbinia a toy craft. Some shipwrights dismissed it as Parsons' folly. In such isolation, he relied on a small circle of loyal engineers, among them Frederick William Smith and George Waller, who believed that experiment could outrun orthodoxy. Together they crafted the vessel that would silence their critics with speed alone. For Parsons, the risk was personal. He poured his savings into the project, knowing failure could ruin his name. Success, he hoped, would redeem more than an idea. It would restore faith in Britain's capacity to innovate without permission. The genius of Turbinia lay not merely in her turbine, but in the way steam and water were reconciled through design. The principle was deceptively simple. Continuous motion requires continuous flow. In the reciprocating engine, steam pushed pistons forward and back. Half of every cycle wasted. Parsons' turbine eliminated that pause. Steam entered at high pressure, passed through a cascade of precisely cut blades, and exited at low pressure, its energy spent entirely on rotation. The motion was constant, unbroken. a perfect circle of power. This mechanical serenity created new challenges. At such high rotational speeds, the propeller became the weak link. Conventional screws, broad-bladed and slow, could not absorb the turbine's immense revolutions. Their tips cavitated, forming vapor bubbles that collapsed with destructive force, eating away the bronze itself. To solve this, Parsons adopted a series configuration. Several smaller propellers along the shaft line, each taking a share of the thrust. By reducing load and diameter, he kept tip speed below the threshold of cavitation, while still translating thousands of revolutions into forward thrust. This approach, later studied in detail at the Admiralty Experiment Works in Haslar, would inform decades of propeller research. In Turbinia's day, however, it was untested. Engineers were trained to think in single screws. Multi-propeller arrangements seemed extravagant and risky. Yet, on the Tyne, the concept worked with startling efficiency. The vessel achieved speeds beyond any naval prediction, proof that mathematics and fluid dynamics, when respected, could outpace the rules of habit. The experiment also hinted at the future of propulsion control. Smooth turbine power meant steadier thrust, less vibration, and far less mechanical wear. Crews could work and sleep without the deafening hammer of pistons. For the first time, speed and comfort coexisted. The maritime world would never look the same once those quiet revolutions were understood. No nation on earth valued stability more than the Royal Navy. Its tradition stretched from Nelson's signal at Trafalgar to the ironclads of the mid-century, a lineage defined by reliability and order. Every ship was a microcosm of hierarchy. Commands flowed downward, innovation cautiously upward. When proposals arrived from private inventors, they entered a labyrinth of departments: construction, engineering, ordnance, each charged with defending its remit. Even minor alterations to a valve might take years to approve. This conservatism was not mere stubbornness. It was the product of experience. Lives depended on predictability. Engines that failed at sea meant ships adrift, convoys endangered, reputations lost. The Navy had been burned before by unproven devices that promised miracles and delivered catastrophe. Parsons' turbine, with its shrieking revolutions and untried propellers, appeared precisely the sort of novelty the Admiralty had sworn to resist. As one internal memo recorded in the National Archives notes, the system is elegant in theory, but impractical for the rigors of service. Behind such language lay deeper anxieties. The established engine builders, those who supplied the great triple expansion engines to naval yards, feared disruption. Whole supply chains and dockyard skills depended on piston technology. If the turbine proved viable, decades of accumulated craft would be rendered obsolete. Admiralty committees, drawn from those same circles, naturally erred on the side of caution. Thus, Parsons found himself locked out not by hostility, but by inertia. His letters to the Director of Naval Construction received polite acknowledgments and no further reply. When he offered trial data, it was deemed insufficient for consideration. The Navy would not risk its reputation on an ion experiment unless that experiment forced itself into history's view, and that was precisely what Parsons intended to do. For all its industrial power, the late Victorian Admiralty was an organization of paperwork and hierarchy. Its senior officers, men of proven seamanship but limited engineering background, governed an empire of machinery by committee. Each new device required layers of approval: design drawings, cost assessments, safety trials, and finally, an endorsement from the board. In this environment, caution became culture. A career could be made by avoiding blame as much as by achieving success. Parsons' turbine fell victim to that machinery long before it touched a ship's hull. The engineering department worried about vibration at high revolutions. The constructors department doubted the propellers. The finance branch asked who would pay for trials. Each had reason to delay. and above them sat an Admiralty board, mindful of Parliament's scrutiny. No one wished to explain a failed experiment before a select committee. Yet not all resisted. A few younger officers, particularly those in the emerging torpedo and destroyer branches, were intrigued. They understood that speed was becoming a weapon in its own right. Reports from France and Germany spoke of fast torpedo craft capable of striking and vanishing before the big guns could traverse. If such vessels multiplied, Britain's heavy fleet might be outmaneuvered. What they needed were counterships, vessels as fast and more durable, capable of pursuing the threat. The reciprocating engine could not deliver that promise. Still, until the turbine proved itself under Admiralty eyes, it would remain a curiosity. Parsons recognized that demonstration, not debate, was the only language the Navy would respect. In engineering, as in command, leadership required not persuasion but example. At the dawn of the 20th century, naval warfare was entering a new dimension. Speed had become the measure of initiative. A faster ship could choose its engagement, outmaneuver the enemy, and escape superior firepower. In the age of radio and long-range gunnery, mobility equaled intelligence. Before Turbinia, destroyers struggled to maintain sustained speeds beyond 20 knots. Their engines groaned under the strain. Mechanical failures were common. The idea of a vessel exceeding 30 knots for extended periods seemed fantasy. Yet Parsons' little craft demonstrated that not only was it possible, it could be done with less vibration and greater efficiency. The tactical consequences were profound. Faster ships could scout ahead of fleets, relaying intelligence in real time. They could chase raiders or intercept torpedo boats before they reached capital ships. Merchant liners equipped with turbines could outrun submarines and maintain tighter schedules across the Atlantic. During the First World War, such advantages would become decisive. But in 1897, they were still hypothetical. Ink on Admiralty paper. Parsons' achievement bridged the gap between theory and practice. His forbidden propeller array translated mathematical possibility into visible, audible proof. When Turbinia roared through the Solent at unprecedented speed, she revealed to every naval observer the true value of innovation, control of time itself. The fleet that mastered velocity would dictate the rhythm of future wars. At its heart, Turbinia's story was not one of rebellion, but of persuasion through fact. It embodied a distinctly British form of defiance. Polite, precise, yet unyielding. Parsons did not shout down his critics. He outperformed them. In doing so, he reflected a national character forged in laboratories as much as in battlefields. The belief that progress, though resisted, would prevail through reason and craftsmanship. Britain in the 1890s was an industrial giant facing its own inertia. Empire had brought wealth, but also complacency. The great factories hummed with established methods. Apprenticeship often meant imitation rather than invention. Into this atmosphere, Parsons introduced discomfort, the reminder that mastery demanded continual reinvention. His success was as much moral as mechanical. It proved that one individual, guided by evidence and determination, could compel institutions to move. When the Admiralty finally embraced turbine propulsion, it was not only a technical victory, but a reaffirmation of national spirit. Adaptation without chaos, progress without boast. The turbine became a metaphor for modern Britain, quietly efficient, continuously turning, driving forward without pause. This moral resonance extended beyond engineering. In later decades, the same ethos would guide British science from radar to jet propulsion. Each began as an outlier's dream, dismissed as impractical until necessity forced acceptance. Turbinia was the prototype not only of modern ships, but of modern innovation itself. It is the morning of Saturday, 26th June 1897, the height of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee Fleet Review. The Solent has become a living gallery of empire. Nearly 200 vessels lie at anchor in ordered rows, Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers gleaming with signal flags and polished brass. Steam launches scurry between them, carrying guests and dignitaries. The royal yacht Victoria and Albert rides at the center like a gilded island. Among the invited spectators stands no place for Charles Algernon Parsons. His applications to display the Turbinia have been refused on procedural grounds. The Admiralty had suggested further correspondence, a polite dismissal. But Parsons has come anyway, towing his small, narrow craft south from Newcastle under secrecy, accompanied by a skeleton crew and a few trusted engineers. Their plan is simple: wait for the right moment, then show the Navy what no permission could forbid. As the official parade begins, 1,000 whistles pierce the air. Columns of smoke rise from every funnel as the great ships salute the sovereign. Spectators on the shore see the water churn with propeller wash. The fleet appears alive. And then, from the eastern edge of the anchorage, another line of foam appears, faint at first, then brightening as it moves against the tide. Someone on a destroyer's bridge shouts a warning. Through binoculars, officers spot a slim white hull approaching at impossible speed. Turbinia has entered the review ground. Her hull trembles as the turbine spins past 2,000 revolutions per minute. Parsons, gripping the wheel, signals his engineer to open the throttle. The boat surges forward. Spray lashes over the deck. Ahead lies the massed power of the Royal Navy. Yet she slices between destroyers as if threading through anchored giants. For a few stunned seconds, the noise of the crowd and bands is drowned by the rising whine of machinery. The strange vessel passes the royal line at over 34 knots, twice the speed of any ship present. Sailors cheer, some wave their caps, others curse as spray drenches their uniforms. A picket launch attempts to intercept, but Turbinia darts past, leaving only a wake and disbelief. From the royal yacht, dignitaries raise their binoculars. Who is this man, defying the fleet itself? A voice on the quarterdeck mutters that it must be Parsons and his infernal turbine. The phrase will echo in newspapers the next morning. Within minutes, the display is over. Turbinia slows, circles wide, and disappears toward the open sea. No official invitation, no speech, no salute, only the unmistakable evidence of speed. But in that brief encounter, every witness has seen the future of marine propulsion written in spray. The Admiralty cannot unsee it, nor can they explain it away. That night, officers at Portsmouth discuss what they have witnessed. Telegrams fly between bureaus. By dawn, Parsons' name has reached the headlines. The private turbine demonstration has become a national revelation. In the hours that followed the Spithead demonstration, telegrams poured into the Admiralty offices at Whitehall. Senior officers, once dismissive of Parsons' work, now found themselves fielding questions from both the press and Parliament. The Times called it an exhibition of extraordinary velocity, the like of which has not been seen upon British waters. The engineer described it, more soberly, as a revolution in propulsion. What had seemed a curiosity from the industrial north was now a matter of national interest. Reports from Portsmouth were relayed to Admiral Sir John Fisher, whose reputation for embracing innovation was already formidable. Fisher saw the potential at once. In a confidential memorandum later preserved in the Admiralty papers, he wrote, "If the turbine achieves in scale what it promises in miniature, the Navy must not delay." Parsons, meanwhile, returned to Newcastle to find himself both celebrated and scrutinized. Admiralty engineers arrived within weeks, armed with measuring instruments and notebooks. They requested speed trials, endurance tests, and technical specifications. Parsons opened his workshops willingly. He had nothing to hide. When the turbine's performance was examined under official supervision, the results were undeniable. Efficiency, vibration, and fuel economy all surpassed contemporary reciprocating engines. But official adoption did not come easily. Conservative elements within the Navy feared that the turbine, though fast, lacked torque for heavy vessels. Others questioned the long-term durability of such high-speed machinery at sea. Parsons countered each objection with data, drawn from months of trials and meticulous record-keeping. He had spent his life anticipating the skepticism of committees. By 1899, the first official contract was issued. A pair of turbine-driven destroyers, HMS Viper and HMS Cobra, would be constructed for full-scale evaluation. When Viper undertook her sea trials, she reached speeds exceeding 36 knots, setting a new naval record. Even the most cautious officers began to recognize that the age of reciprocating steam was ending. Yet progress came at a cost. In 1901, Cobra was lost in the North Sea after her hull fractured in heavy seas. Though the cause lay in her light construction rather than the turbine itself, the tragedy cast a shadow over Parsons' triumph. Critics were swift to blame his technology, but investigations by the Admiralty Board of Inquiry cleared the turbines of fault. Parsons responded not with defense, but with improvement, refining his designs, strengthening his materials, and applying lessons learned. His resilience echoed the very ethos of British engineering: steady, self-correcting, and unswayed by applause or accusation. Within a decade, every major Royal Navy vessel, from destroyer to dreadnought, would carry turbine propulsion. The system, once dismissed as impractical, became the standard of maritime power. By 1906, when HMS Dreadnought steamed from Portsmouth on her maiden voyage, her Parsons turbines turning smoothly beneath the deck, she represented not only the birth of a new naval age, but the vindication of one man's vision. That day at Spithead had altered more than a parade. It had changed the direction of British sea power. And as Europe edged toward the tensions that would erupt in 1914, the ships built in the wake of Parsons' defiance would form the steel backbone of Britain's defense. By the opening years of the 20th century, the reverberations of Parsons' invention could be heard far beyond the Tyne. In shipyards from Barrow to Clydebank, the language of propulsion had changed. The once familiar thud and hiss of the reciprocating engine was being replaced by the steady, high-pitched hum of turbine machinery. Engineers spoke of revolutions per minute rather than strokes of a piston. Britain's maritime heart was learning a new rhythm. The Admiralty's decision to adopt turbine power for all new destroyers and cruisers had an immediate industrial consequence. Parsons' firm, C.A. Parsons and Company, expanded rapidly, supplying turbines not only to the Royal Navy, but to civilian liners and merchant vessels. Shipbuilders such as John Brown and Company, Fairfield, and Vickers began licensing the technology, integrating turbine rooms into their designs. What had begun as a private experiment in a converted workshop at Heaton became a cornerstone of the industrial Northeast. The change was not merely mechanical, it was cultural. The shipwrights of the Tyne and Clyde, many of them men whose fathers had hammered rivets for the Victorian Navy, found themselves retrained in new disciplines: precision machining, metallurgical balancing, fluid dynamics. Apprenticeship schemes were revised. Universities established new chairs in mechanical and marine engineering. Parsons himself endowed lectureships at Newcastle and Cambridge, insisting that scientific education must remain wedded to practical craftsmanship. "The engineer's imagination," he wrote in a 1903 address, "must always end in steel." In London, the Admiralty's technical department began to view power not simply as a measure of coal burned, but as a strategic asset. Turbine-driven vessels required less maintenance, fewer crew for the engine rooms, and could sustain higher speeds for longer distances. This altered naval doctrine. Patrol zones widened, interception tactics evolved, and the Navy's global mobility increased. The Empire's scattered bases, from Gibraltar to Singapore, became more closely linked by turbine propulsion than by telegraph. Civilian industry was equally transformed. The Cunard Line commissioned Lusitania and Mauretania with Parsons turbines, ushering in a new era of transatlantic speed. When Mauretania captured the Blue Riband in 1907, her success was celebrated not as a victory of a shipping line, but of British engineering. The Illustrated London News wrote, "Her engines, of native design and manufacture, carry the flag of innovation as proudly as any ensign." Even beyond the shipyards, the turbine reshaped Britain's industrial identity. The same principles would soon be applied to electrical generation, laying the groundwork for modern power stations. Parsons' designs became the blueprint for machines that would light the cities of the 20th century. From turbines turning beneath ocean liners to those spinning in the basements of power plants, his influence threaded through every layer of modern life. Yet, for all its triumphs, the transition demanded cost and courage. Thousands of older engineers were displaced or retrained. Traditional workshops closed. Britain's mastery of the seas came at the price of continual adaptation. But this too became part of the national ethos, change not as a threat, but as duty. The same spirit that had endured the hardships of the industrial age now embraced the demands of the modern one. By 1910, Britain had become the world's foremost producer of turbine technology. Parsons turbines powered vessels not only for the Royal Navy, but for Japan, Russia, and Italy. The Admiralty guarded the details of their construction with secrecy, yet the essential idea had escaped into the world. Innovation, once forbidden, had become Britain's greatest export. When war broke out in August 1914, the sound of the turbine had already become the soundtrack of the Royal Navy. In harbors from Scapa Flow to Devonport, turbine-driven cruisers and dreadnoughts slipped their moorings, their machinery humming with a smooth metallic confidence. The age of the piston had ended. Britain now went to war propelled by the steady whisper of Parsons' genius. At sea, the impact was immediate. The turbine's ability to sustain speed and reliability under strain changed the nature of naval engagements. Fleets could maneuver more freely, maintaining formation without the vibration and mechanical fatigue that had plagued earlier engines. In the Battle of the Falklands, 1914, the turbine-powered battlecruisers Invincible and Inflexible closed on the German squadron with relentless precision, their speed decisive. Admiralty reports noted that engine performance was uniform throughout action. No loss of revolutions under full steam. The technology that had once seemed a laboratory curiosity was now a weapon of empire. But Parsons' turbines did more than drive ships. They defined the modern concept of energy. During the war, the same principles were applied to electrical generation, arming factories and dockyards with dependable power. The machinery that had sped a vessel across the Solent now turned the dynamos that built aircraft, munitions, and communications equipment. In this sense, Parsons' contribution transcended the Navy. It became woven into Britain's industrial defense. Parsons himself lived to see this transformation with quiet satisfaction. He was knighted in 1911, elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, and later awarded the Order of Merit. Yet those who met him described not a triumphant industrialist, but a reserved, courteous engineer, more at ease in his laboratory than at banquets. Visitors to his Heaton works found him moving among apprentices and draftsmen, sleeves rolled, asking practical questions about torque and blade geometry. To him, invention was not a moment, but a process, an endless refinement of motion and material. After the war, as Britain rebuilt, the turbine continued to evolve. Steam gave way to gas. Ships grew larger, faster, and more complex. But every design owed something to the blueprint Parsons had drawn in the 1890s. Even the first generation of Royal Navy aircraft carriers, such as HMS Hermes and Courageous, sailed with turbine power. What had once astonished the Admiralty had become indispensable to it. By the time of Parsons' death in 1931, his technology powered not only the Navy, but the merchant fleets, the liners, and the generating stations that illuminated Britain's cities. In the archives of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, a colleague wrote, "He changed the sound of power from a hammer to a hum." In Tyneside, where his workshops had first been dismissed as eccentric, the locals remembered him differently. They spoke of Parsons lads, the generations of craftsmen who had found steady work in the turbine shops. To them, his legacy was not only in metal, but in livelihoods. His invention had turned a city of riveters into a city of precision engineers, and across the empire, from Singapore's dockyards to Halifax shipyards in Nova Scotia, turbine machinery bore the inscription, "Made in Britain." The hum that began in the Solent spread across the oceans, a mechanical anthem of modernity. By the 1930s, when the clouds of another war began to gather, British shipyards were ready. The fast destroyers, cruisers, and carriers of the Second World War owed their agility and reliability to the design principles Parsons had established a generation earlier. His forbidden propeller idea had become the foundation of a nation's defense. It is said that history turns not on thunder, but on whispers. On that day in 1897, as a small experimental vessel skimmed past the Queen's fleet, the future of power did not roar. It sang. Innovation often arrives quietly. It does not demand attention. It insists only on proof. Charles Algernon Parsons understood this. His turbine, dismissed as reckless and forbidden, did not conquer the world with fanfare. It simply worked. It turned, hummed, and carried Britain forward, transforming naval power, merchant shipping, and industrial capability without spectacle or exaggeration. In that gentle persistence lies a truth about British engineering in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Courage was measured in calculation as much as in action, and heroism often wore overalls rather than medals. Parsons' story exemplifies the quiet defiance, patience, and precision that defined an era of progress. He did not overthrow tradition with force. He persuaded it with evidence, guiding the nation toward a future it had not yet imagined. The ripple effects of his work extended far beyond a single vessel. Turbines became the standard of modern fleets, the heartbeat of ocean liners, and the hum in power stations that lit cities across the empire. Britain's capacity to adapt, to integrate invention into industry and defense, became a cornerstone of national strength. And through it all, Parsons' principle remained unchanged. Mastery of motion comes from understanding, persistence, and respect for natural law. The lesson endures. In the machinery of fleets, the architecture of cities, and the laboratories of future engineers, the quiet hum of innovation continues to shape outcomes. Parsons' forbidden propeller was more than a technical breakthrough. It was a testament to reason, courage, and the conviction that progress can prevail even against the weight of orthodoxy. As we consider the ships that sailed past Spithead, the turbines that hummed beneath their decks, and the engineers who followed Parsons' example, one is reminded that history is not only written in victories or battles, but in the measured, persistent turning of ideas into reality. And sometimes, the softest hum carries the greatest power.